Today, I'm going to be talking about how you can secure your remote workforce with the Zero Trust security model. My name is Joe Custer. I'm the Director for Security and Compliance Solutions across Quisitive. We've got about 25 years in the field for securing organizations around the globe. Now, as we go through today's content, it's worth considering that this is foundational to enabling your digital transformation in a way that doesn't put your organization at risk. How do you say yes more without losing control of your data, your applications, your devices, and of course, your users? Now, before we jump into that, two simple truths. Everybody in your organization has work as top of mind. Everybody's just trying to get their job done. Inefficient processes, friction, anything around those points frustrate them. It makes it very easy for somebody to get frustrated with the security process and then try and do something else that will avoid that. Likewise, there's something worth noting, which is there's someone in almost every organization who will click anything. Well, there's always going to be that argument. We need to beef up training, but also it points out that no matter what your technology controls are, they will never be perfect. There will always be someone who gets phished, some piece of malware, some new type of attack. So inside that scenario, you have to assume breach, that someone somewhere has done something they shouldn't have, whether that's an insider threat or an external actor. Now, likewise, when we start looking at the state of the environment and the state of the world in terms of the security spectrum, Forrester was out there in 2017, a full 5 years ago, stating legacy perimeter-centric models of information security are of no use in today's digital businesses. Now, why would they say that? Almost everybody has the crunchy outer shell of security and the ooey gooey center of trust, and that's the way networks and security has been designed for decades. Well, the reality is they're just acknowledging that your data no longer just exists on-prem, and it's become incredibly apparent over the last few years. But really across that, it was just highlighting some of the weaknesses inherent into the old models. And as we started looking at things like cloud applications, work from home, mobile devices, that put a lot of pressure on the old way of doing things. And then you add in COVID-19. Almost overnight, every organization had to radically retool and adjust to a new normal to be able to stay in business, how to keep everybody busy. You went from overnight 3.6% of end users being remote to a vast amount of people. You had entire organizations that had to go mobile overnight, basically. Now, not everybody did that. There's going to be various scenarios where, hey, I still have a lot of my stuff on-prem. Maybe I'm enabling VPNs, maybe I'm scrambling. But that rapid proliferation of abnormal shoulder things that were kind of off on the side and largely unmanaged and often unacknowledged really put a lot of pressure on the old perimeter model. Because the old assumption was, I protect my area on-prem. That's where everything's important is. Well, it really isn't true. Because as we started looking at that old assumptions, remote users are few and far between. They're going to be partners in mobile. But we separate them. We segment them. Really, it's the DMZ, the semi-secure network, my VPN endpoints. But inside of my network, I have my end user devices, my admin devices, and my company servers. But the reality is when we start looking at things like ransomware, it was spreading like wildfire from one device to another. And lateral attacks happen all the time where they're able to leverage a lesser used device or a lower permissioned end user to be able to compromise laterally throughout the environment, to be able to get to your important stuff. And part of that was just simply some fatally wrong assumptions that all risks are external. Hey, if the bad guys are only outside, then I just need to protect my inside. Well, the challenge is what about insider risk where somebody's doing something wrong or somebody's letting them in? via being fooled through social engineering, through phishing, etc. And it also assumes that devices aren't transient. It's as simple as saying I'm taking a device home, I'm connecting to an untrusted device or untrusted network, and I'm moving it back on-prem. That happens all the time. But it was one of those situations that the old perimeter model really wasn't prepared to address, because if they were off-site, I may have secured and prevented them from doing something, but they move it back on-site. And based on nothing more than their IP address, there's the assumed that they're trustworthy. Well, that has some really fatal flaws in that assumption. So that's built a good case for the model that I'm going to cover today, which is zero trust. And this isn't a Microsoft thing, a Cisco thing. It's the entire industry, from CISA to all the individual vendors out there. There's been a massive shift in how we format and structure and architect our security. Now, what's different about it? Well, it's not designed around IP addressing and saying, hey, we're going to focus on just the network. It's layering in tools working together to be able to provide a common control plane. And that trust is going to have policies and monitoring and governance, and it's going to secure your identities and your endpoint and your infrastructure and your applications, and of course, your data. As we go through all of those pieces of the puzzle, they're designed to be working together as opposed to just making assumptions about the rest of the environment. So when they're working together, they're doing checks. So this can look a little complicated, but it doesn't need to be. Many of you are already doing much of this. And really, it's about using the tools in a unique way. And so instead of saying, hey, you're on my network, you must be trustworthy, you must be managed, it's instead using an earned access flow. It starts at zero. It's simply saying, just because you're a device and I can talk to you doesn't mean you're trustworthy. I'm going to validate your identity. I'm going to validate your connection, that you meet my security requirements, that your device is configured correctly and meets my requirements, that your app is fine and your rights and so forth. And you finally go through all those things while you're monitoring it, you're governing it, you're applying all of those different pieces of the puzzle that make up what's important to you for your control plane. And then you give access to that specific thing because it's become earned. So it's not saying you're never going to trust something. It's saying that you're earning that trust at each stage. So with that model, that gives you quite a bit of capabilities. Now, there's a lot that can go into it, and there's multiple maturities. Most organizations are coming in from a traditional model. Hey, we've been relying on the on-prem network and firewall as our key security methodology for eons. And inside that shift doesn't mean you have to get rid of your old tools. You'll notice that a lot of these things, as you mature, it's just repurposing or retooling how you're focusing things. So I don't need to drain this. All of this is available, and all of these actually align to, government recommendations and various other pieces. And most of your security vendors will be focusing on this as well. Really across this is being able to mature from where you're at today to something that is reactive and dynamic. When something goes wrong, it's able to identify, isolate, and ideally remediate those particular threats. Now, really across this, you may be thinking, oh, what about that control plane architecture had a lot going on. How do I know what I actually need here? And the reality is that there's a very simple scenario that I ask most of my customers to think through. It's as simple as saying, what would you do differently if every user was on bring your own device mobile? Well, you're probably going to say, well, I need to make sure that the device is inventoried. I need to make sure that it's managed, that it's encrypted, that the user is using multi-factor, that I have some sort of monitoring and endpoint protection. And that's your list. All of those things that you would do to be able to say, okay, I need to containerize my data to limit the risk of those things, that's perfect. Well, why wouldn't you apply those same capabilities to on-prem as well? And that's what this comes down to, is being able to stop attacks on-prem and off-prem using tools that are designed to work across those scenarios. And it's not even saying I have to say yes to BYOD mobile. It's just saying this is a foundation and a framework that will work on-prem, off-prem, cloud. But if something happens, whether that's an on-prem device or cloud user, it gives me the ability of isolating a threat and being able to protect the rest of the environment, to be able to know about those pieces and ideally remediate on the fly. So let's talk through some scenarios where we're applying tools of this nature. So most organizations inside this group are going to have, as an example, an Office 365 or Microsoft presence of some sort. That's just what I'm more familiar with. But these tools and technologies are going to be fairly agnostic. There's going to be a way of replicating these type of capabilities through other tools as well. But we're really across this. Say, for instance, I have a sensitive file on SharePoint on-prem, and I have an end user that needs to access that from an iPad, and they need to access it remotely. Well, I'm going to say I need to manage that device. I need to have it enrolled inside of a mobile device management tool. Okay, well, that gives me extra capabilities. Brings in containerization of my data, manage browser, device policies, security controls. I know that that meets my requirements. But I also have to enable the connection. Well, I have as an example an Azure application proxy, which is, if it helps, you may think of it as a VPN, but it's an ad hoc SSL VPN tunnel that doesn't require me having a VPN endpoint exposed on my DMZ. It allows cloud-based connections to happen. Many organizations are able to get rid of their VPNs using tools and technologies like that. However, there's a reason why I would do that, and that's because it brings in conditional access. Now, that conditional access brings in risk-based authentication. If something looks strange, something looks a little concerning, I can make things happen. So I can check for multi-factor authentication. I can look for compromised account detection. I can make sure that the device and the user and all the other different pieces of the puzzle that I might want on my checklist are being met. Now, of course, I need monitoring. So I'm going to have like Defender for identity. It's looking for suspicious activity on those devices. So my SharePoint server and the endpoint are going to be talking together. So I can correlate those events. And of course, I have, as an example, my information protection stack. So as an example, Microsoft Purview. Really across that, that's an item level protection that's going to follow that data regardless of where it goes. So that gives me my audit log, who accessed what. So even if it's copied to an external device, I still have encryption on it. I still have protection. I have rights management, and I can revoke access at any time. Now, what happens when something bad happens? Say, for instance, an end user has left my organization after they copied all their content onto a thumb drive. Well, guess what? That information protection can kick in, and the end user is unable to decrypt their files if the AD account is disabled, the device is no longer compliant, things like that. So that gives me some capabilities to prevent that information from going anywhere. Now let's flip it around to a different scenario. What if the user is phished? Okay, well, in those scenarios, it's going to trigger the compromised account detection. Password's going to be immediately reset. Automated investigations are going to be triggered. They can't get access to it either. So it builds in those scenarios. Now, likewise, if we start shifting to, say, an unmanaged device, and I've got a sensitive information file inside OneDrive, well, the same sorts of things can work together, even if I don't have management on the endpoint. So I can start using sync controls. I can start enforcing encryption on transit, file versioning for backups. My conditional access is going to kick in again at the identity level, make sure that the right things are kicking in before I allow my user access. And of course, I can have cloud application security working with session controls to be able to prescribe, here's the type of protections for this exact scenario. Are you using a current browser? Are you using something out of date? I can make those rules different. I can do ransomware detection, etc. And again, my information protection is going to be applied. I have the rights management at the endpoint with the application is going to enforce things like copy paste protection to prevent that data from being copied where I don't want it. Now, in that scenario, if a user tries to take something sensitive, they want to screenshot content from an Excel document. Well, we have that containerization to prevent that from going to an unapproved source. They can copy and paste it within approved sources just fine, but I'm not going to let you paste it to an unmanaged web browser as an example. So it blocks things there on the spot, even though you've trusted it up to this point. So again, that becomes very important. Files shared with unauthorized domain, same sort of scenario, but it can immediately say, hold up, you're not, this is sensitive information. You're trying to share it where I don't trust the end user, or I don't trust the domain. I can immediately identify that something has been shared in a way that does not meet my organization's requirements, and I can isolate that, block the attempt, log it, and I might go so far as to automate sending the end user a data handling policy reminder and maybe their supervisor as well to be able to acknowledge that. And of course, I'm going to have work from home scenarios. And we get into things like payroll tax, they're incredibly common. So inside those scenarios, we have a workflow of tools working together to be able to provide the identity, app, network, all these things working in conjunction so that if something happens, we're able to isolate it. But we can also do conditional scenarios. Say, for instance, you're the payroll admin. Well, if you're on your managed device, I'm going to let you manage direct deposit information. But the moment you're coming in from a work from home device that's not managed and doesn't meet my requirements, I may limit what you're able to do. I may let you see your information, but I'm not going to let you adjust other people's information. So session controls give us that capability, and we can say, well, you can't use your admin rights on this scenario, but you can, as an example, view your pay stub. So those capabilities are foundational to being able to take advantage of what Zero Trust offers. Now, tips on building your own control plane, because this enables a lot of those scenarios that a lot of organizations haven't been able to say yes to. Really, if you want to be able to start building your own or checking where you're at, think holistically. Start with the identity and solve upward on this pyramid. Move up through your identity, your network/environment, your devices, your application, and data. So think through, how would you solve securing your identity? Now that's going to look a little different for each organization, but some of the questions you can ask yourself: what type of data do I have? Where does it go? What devices are my users using? And what services need protection? Well, then I think through, well, if I need to protect my end users, here's the type of things I need. I need multi-factor risk session controls. If I'm protecting the devices, I might need endpoint protection or endpoint management. And you go through and you start answering these key questions. Now, it's important to understand that most organizations can't do this all in one fell swoop. Frequently, it's a phased adoption. Hey, I'm going to solve this for these easy, low-hanging fruit first. I'm going to build forward. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good here. Now, one of the things to factor in as you're asking these questions at each step of this, ask yourself, what would happen if a user was compromised or somebody was doing something bad? How would I identify that? How would I remediate that? Those are going to be critical questions to ask yourself as you're building your control plane. Now, the other part is assume breach. Don't assume that everything's clean from day one. Matter of fact, we do hundreds and hundreds of security assessments each year. And as we go through those scenarios, most organizations do not have a clean state. Now, where are you at? You may already be on your path with Zero Trust. You may be just starting. You may be just looking at it. But I've given some bullets here to be able to help recognize where you're at. Things like multi-factor authentication for every single user. That's not advanced security. That is basic table stakes at today. With the types of attacks organizations like you are facing, it is critical. Do you have the visibility into devices? Do you know which ones are compliant? Most organizations don't have a complete list. So being able to identify where things are going rogue inside your organization are critical. Now, as we go through all of these pieces, this gives you some frameworks, some questions to ask. Now, to recap though, Zero Trust can drastically improve your organization's security. And really across this, it helps you say yes to a lot of your digital transformations. So we can start saying, I'll allow vendors, I'll allow work from home, I'll allow BYOD because I have a control plane that can make sure that I haven't lost control of my data and that I haven't put my users at risk in this process. Likewise, as we start looking at, do I need to buy a whole bunch of new things? Well, the answer may be no. Frankly, a lot of the tools already work for these. They just may need to be reconfigured so that you're, as an example, hey, just because I'm on the network does not mean I get unlimited access to all of the other peer endpoints on that same network. Containerizing that from that perspective. Go through your control plane exercises to ask yourself those questions. Now, as you go through and you start maturing and start building out your cloud presence, it's often the easiest place to start because, frankly, zero trust is baked into a lot of cloud platforms. Especially, I can speak to the Microsofts more in depth on others, but really across that, it's going to be frequently your low-hanging fruit. Now, going back and addressing, what about my on-prem? There's phased approaches. CISA has fantastic guidance specific to government organizations on how to be able to help build your complete architecture there. Microsoft likewise does as well. But most organizations wildly overestimate where they're at. And this exercise can help identify the weak spots that they have. And so that is critical information. Now, if you need assistance in plotting your course, what tools do I need? How do I configure? How do I stack up? Hey, I've taken a swing at things. Did I do it right? Of course, we're glad to help. But really, I hope this has given you a little snippet that can be useful in being able to understand where the security industry is heading and some of the advantages of how you can start saying yes to more scenarios without putting your organization at risk. So with that, thank you all very much for jumping in today. And if you do have additional questions, if you want to be able to reach out and connect and ask specific pieces about information you've heard today, please reach out. We're glad to help. Likewise, it's also very important. Give us your feedback because this gives our team the feedback on can we do better, what's going to be useful to you, and it helps us support you with more content that's suited to your needs. So with that, thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of the event.